What factors do you believe contributed most significantly to the 29% increase in U.S. arms exports in 2024?
Oh, thank you very much. In the United States, this is called security cooperation. And when this is done well, it can actually deter an outbreak of war. In the case of Ukraine, which I think the vast majority of that increase is responsible, it would have prevented or at least deterred the calculation by the Russians to launch the February 2022 invasion. But done poorly, we see the results of that. And now we're in a situation, the other side of security cooperation are arms sales to allies or like-minded countries, in this case, Ukraine. And that is to ensure that U.S. interests are best defended by a partner that's already engaged in a conflict. Right now, on the other side of the world, there's another large draw for U.S. security cooperation, ostensibly to deter another war in the Pacific, which would be much larger, deadly, and have global consequences far outstripping what we're seeing in Ukraine and the Middle East in the last several years. And that is the provision of warships and weapons to countries like treaty ally the Philippines, but also sales under favorable financing terms. Again, this is part of the security cooperation construct of the United States government to ensure that Taiwan has an adequate defense to prevent or deter a Chinese communist invasion of the island, which is a 80-year threat.
Mr. Ashri, how do you see the U.S. arms sales impacting or reflecting on geopolitical tensions, particularly in regions like the Middle East and Eastern Europe? Mr. Ashri, can you hear us, sir? We will try and get back to Mr. Ashri. Mr. Sadler, the current arms export strategy, how does it align with the broader U.S. foreign policy objectives? You've mentioned the nature of the cooperation, but how does it reflect, and what really foreign policy objectives are we going to see for 2025?
Well, it's a good question. It would be speculative to guess what the new administration that is still getting its people in place, what they actually will be able to accomplish. But what is clear with the selection of Undersecretary Bridge Colby at the Department of Defense and Senator Rubio to lead as the Secretary of State and Mike Waltz as the Senior Security Advisor to the President, there is very clear intent to focus most of that activity, military sales and security cooperation, to the Pacific region, because it is there where the threat is the largest from China. But there is decades-long history that has very unbalanced from what the United States' strategic interests are, but where it is spending its very scant resources in the security cooperation. Things like the Camp David Accords, that has a significant amount of money that goes to Egypt and to Israel to ensure a truce and security agreement that goes back decades remains in place.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about Eastern Europe? How do U.S. allies, such as NATO members, respond to increasing pressure to allocate more resources to defense?
Well, back in President Obama's administration, that was where the NATO countries came together and agreed to spend 2% of their GDP. None of them actually really stepped up to that until President Trump began to name and shame and actually make some threats, some of them very explicit, that there would be a consequence of NATO partner countries not carrying their full share of the defense. But it really was Putin's invasion in February of 2022 that shocked the NATO countries to take action, most notably Germany, but Eastern European countries, again led by countries like Romania and Poland, have been on an upward trend of spending more on their defense and contributing thereby more to the collective security of the NATO writ large. But there's still much work to be done. And there is concern here in D.C. that once a treaty or a negotiated solution in Ukraine is sealed, that the pressure for countries like Spain, Italy, and France will be let up, and they'll go back to spending far too little on their outdated, antiquated, and in many cases, largely inadequate militaries.